From the moment a young woman's name was whispered among the sacred halls of the Mayan priests, a shadow would fall over her life, a shadow thick with dread and awe. She was not merely chosen, she was claimed by the gods themselves, or so the priests would proclaim, their voices echoing with a chilling authority that left families trembling. The selection process was shrouded in ceremony, yet behind the elaborate masks of devotion lurked something far darker. Women were plucked from the safety of their homes, often without warning, their futures rewritten by hands that claimed divine inspiration. In the eyes of the priests, these women were vessels of the sacred, conduits through which the gods would manifest their will. But this sanctity carried a terrifying price. The chosen were paraded through ritualized corridors of expectation, adorned in ceremonial attire that seemed more a shroud than a celebration. Their steps, measured and forced, echoed in the stone halls like the faint cries of those who had walked this path before. Women whose stories had been swallowed by time, yet whose suffering lingered in every carved depiction on the temple walls. The priest's gaze, both reverent and predatory, weighed upon them, reading their fear, shaping it, bending it until the women themselves could no longer distinguish between obedience and despair. Preparations began immediately, and the air grew thick with incense and ominous chants that vibrated through the bones, imprinting in the chosen an indelible awareness of the gravity they had inherited. Each movement, each word uttered by the clergy, was a reminder of a destiny that offered no escape, a ritualistic dance that merged devotion with terror. Families watched, powerless, as their daughters were transformed into instruments of divine will, their humanity receding under the weight of expectation and dread. This initial act of selection was not simply a ceremonial tradition, it was a declaration of absolute control, a message to all who observed that the gods' favor was inextricably linked to fear, and that resistance was inconceivable. The young women, innocent yet irrevocably marked, began to understand the duality of their calling. To embody holiness was to endure suffering. To be exalted by the gods meant to be enmeshed in the shadows of horror that only the priests could navigate. And so, the stage was set, the ritual's machinery turning inexorably, as the chosen prepared to cross thresholds from which there was no return, every heartbeat echoing with the silent screams of those who had been chosen before them. The horrifying reality that awaited was veiled in sanctity, yet as the sun fell over the temples, the line between reverence and atrocity became impossibly thin, and the audience, if one could call the terrified witnesses that, would soon learn that the divine selection of women by Mayan priests was a darkness far more cruel than imagination alone could conceive. If you are captivated by the chilling depths of ancient rituals and wish to uncover more hidden horrors, make sure to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to follow the shadows of history with us. The priests of the Maya were more than spiritual guides. They were the architects of destiny, wielding authority that blurred the lines between sacred duty and personal power. Clad in elaborate robes and headdresses, their presence commanded awe and fear in equal measure. Each priest bore the weight of generations, a lineage steeped in ritual knowledge and clandestine wisdom that few outside their order could comprehend. They moved through the temples with calculated precision, their hands performing rites that had been refined over centuries, each gesture designed to communicate with deities whose demands were absolute. The chosen women were acutely aware of their gaze, a mixture of reverence and cold calculation, as though the priests were reading not only their physical forms, but the innermost recesses of their souls. It was this omnipotent scrutiny, that made the priests terrifying. They controlled not only what could be seen, but also the hidden currents of fear and expectation that surged through the hearts of the selected. Their decisions could mean life or death, exaltation or obliteration, and every movement, every whispered chant, was executed to reinforce their dominance. The power they exercised was not merely ritualistic, it was psychological, binding the women in invisible chains that transcended physical confinement. Each priest knew the intricacies of human emotion, exploiting innocence and hope, twisting reverence into submission, and ensuring that resistance was not an option. The temples themselves were extensions of their influence, architecture meticulously designed to inspire awe, to funnel attention and energy toward their ceremonies, making every chosen woman feel simultaneously sacred and trapped. As the priests orchestrated the complex web of offerings, prayers, and ceremonial rites, the women's lives became a canvas upon which divine authority and human cruelty were interwoven. Observers, whether commoners or other members of the priestly order, could see the outward beauty and devotion, but the underlying mechanics of control remained hidden, a silent testament to the absolute power these men held. And in this dynamic, fear was a currency, respect a weapon, and the priests, invisible strings pulling at the very souls of those selected, ensured that the rituals would unfold precisely as dictated by both tradition and their unchallenged dominion. Before the ultimate ordeal could begin, the women were subjected to meticulous preparations that were both physical and spiritual, designed to strip away their individuality and replace it with a vessel-like devotion to the gods. Days, sometimes weeks, were consumed by rituals that involved fasting, ceremonial baths, and an array of symbolic markings that turned their skin into a canvas of sacred signs. Every act, every chant was intended to instill obedience, to blur the line between fear and reverence, to erode the fragile boundary of self until the chosen felt as though their very essence had been surrendered to a higher power. The temples became theaters of transformation, echoing with the sounds of drums and flutes, the air thick with incense that burned the lungs yet seemed to cleanse the soul. Priests oversaw these preparations with an unflinching gaze, their hands tracing intricate patterns over the women's bodies, anointing them with sacred oils, drawing invisible lines of fate upon their flesh. The young women were taught the language of the ritual, memorizing prayers whose meaning was heavy with the weight of destiny, yet often cryptic and frightening in its ambiguity. Their movements were rehearsed, gestures perfected, as though any hesitation might invoke the wrath of the gods or the disappointment of the priests. Isolation was a common tool. Chosen women were kept apart from friends and family, surrounded only by the cold stone of the temple, the constant chanting, and the omnipresent eyes of the clergy. This deliberate separation intensified their vulnerability, making them more malleable, more receptive to suggestion, until they were no longer acting out of personal will, but as conduits for forces they barely understood. Even their sleep was controlled, broken into cycles of ceremony and reflection, their dreams infiltrated by the omnipresence of divine expectation. In this way, the preparatory phase was far more than mere ceremony. It was a psychological crucible, a calculated stripping away of autonomy to ensure that when the moment of ultimate offering arrived, the women would walk forward, not as individuals, but as embodiments of the God's will. The oppressive atmosphere of preparation, though cloaked in the language of sanctity, concealed the true horror. Each ritual act was a rehearsal for suffering, each blessing a prelude to pain, and each whispered chant a reminder that once chosen, there was no retreat from the inexorable machinery of fate the priests commanded. The journey to the temple was a passage both physical and psychological, a slow march that marked the transition from life as they knew it to a reality dictated entirely by the priests. The chosen women walked in solemn procession, their heads bowed under the weight of ceremonial headdresses, every step measured, every movement scrutinized. Stone pathways wound through courtyards where shadows of towering structures stretched like silent sentinels, and the air was heavy with incense and the murmurs of onlookers who sensed that something sacred and terrifying was unfolding. Fear was a constant companion, whispering doubts into minds that were already burdened by the knowledge of what awaited. Families and villagers watched in silence, powerless to intervene, hearts caught between pride in divine selection and horror at the unknown fate of their daughters, sisters, or wives. The priests walked among them, moving with an authority that brooked no question, their eyes scanning for hesitation, any falter punished not with immediate violence, but with a subtle, oppressive reminder of the consequences of disobedience. The walls of the temple grew taller, more imposing, as the procession advanced, as though the very stones themselves were conspiring to make the women feel smaller, more fragile, and increasingly aware of their vulnerability. Every step brought them closer to the threshold of horror that lay beyond, where sacred rituals and unfathomable cruelty intersected in ways that would test both body and spirit. The tension was palpable, a living force that clung to skin and bone, as if the very air conspired with the priests to remind the chosen of their ultimate subjugation. Observing this journey, one could feel the duality of reverence and fear, the unsettling recognition that divinity and cruelty were intertwined, each amplifying the other. The journey to the temple was more than a mere procession. It was an induction into a world where sanctity masked suffering, where the eyes of the gods were mirrored in the unblinking gaze of the clergy, and where every step taken carried the weight of destiny. For those who have reflected on the chilling realities of ancient rituals before, share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you imagine went through the minds of these women as they approached the threshold of the unimaginable? Once the chosen women reached the sacred chamber, the rituals of purification began, rituals that blurred the boundary between sanctity and pain. The priests employed a combination of physical and spiritual disciplines designed to break the women down while elevating them to a state of perceived holiness. The air inside the temple was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning herbs, a sensory onslaught that left the senses disoriented, the mind more susceptible to suggestion. Priests guided the women through sequences of symbolic gestures, anointing them with oils and paints that carried deep esoteric significance, each stroke a reminder of their vulnerability and obedience. The women were compelled to endure fasting, strenuous postures, and ritualized penances that tested both body and psyche, amplifying the tension between fear and devotion. Every touch of the priest, every whispered command, was deliberate, a precise manipulation meant to imprint a dual consciousness, reverence for the divine and acute awareness of their own fragility. Pain and devotion became indistinguishable as the rituals unfolded, each act a reinforcement of the priest's absolute authority and the inescapable demands of the gods. In some cases, the purification involved more severe forms of endurance, ritualized cuts, symbolic burns, or exposure to elements designed to evoke both fear and submission. The boundaries between martyrdom and brutality, intentionally blurred. The women's cries were muffled by chants and music, creating a haunting symphony that echoed through the stone halls, reinforcing the ritual's gravity. This phase of preparation was not merely physical, it was psychological conditioning, an intense indoctrination that reshaped identity and instilled a sense of inevitability. By the time the purification ended, the women were no longer merely individuals. They were embodiments of sacred purpose, yet shadows of themselves, their autonomy eroded by the meticulous orchestration of priestly power. In this space, devotion was inseparable from torment. Holiness intertwined with suffering, and every heartbeat became a testimony to the priest's unyielding control over body, mind, and spirit. The culmination of the rituals was the act that the priests had orchestrated for generations: the human sacrifice. This was not merely a performance of devotion. It was an intricate dance of symbolism and terror, where the line between religious fervor and horror vanished. Each movement, each chant, and every ceremonial offering was imbued with meaning that only the clergy fully understood, a language of suffering and divinity interwoven into a single, relentless expression. The women, their bodies and minds prepared through weeks of ritual, were brought to the altar, a space both exalted and terrifying, where stone carvings depicted past offerings and whispered warnings of the gods' expectations. Priests manipulated every aspect of the environment. Fire, water, incense, and sacred instruments were orchestrated to evoke a trance-like state, heightening fear and reverence simultaneously. The act itself was often brutal, designed to reflect the gods' power over life and death, and to cement the authority of the clergy who administered it. Blood, considered a conduit to the divine, was shed with precise ritualistic intent, each drop symbolizing cosmic balance, spiritual cleansing, or appeasement of deities, whose temperaments were thought to be as volatile as they were omnipotent. Witnesses, if they dared look, were enveloped in a spectacle that fused awe with dread. A ritual theater where the suffering of the chosen was sanctified and transformed into a spiritual currency that reinforced the social and religious hierarchy. And yet, beyond the symbolic, there was an undeniable human horror. Young women, terrified and powerless, rendered instruments of divine will, their lives measured not by their own hearts, but by the dictates of priests who held the sacred and the brutal in equal hands. The symbolic weight of sacrifice merged seamlessly with visceral reality, leaving no distinction between what was holy and what was horrific. Through these acts, the Mayan priests maintained their dominion, their ability to shape society's perception of the sacred through terror, and the chilling understanding that to be chosen was to be placed at the mercy of forces seen and unseen, human and divine, alike. Historical accounts and testimonies provide glimpses into the unbearable suffering endured by these women. Yet even these fragmented records cannot fully capture the depth of their torment. Chroniclers, both native and foreign, described the ritualized screams, the pall of incense mixing with the metallic scent of blood, and the eerie stillness that followed the priest's commands. Survivors, rare though their voices were, spoke in hushed tones of the psychological chains that bound them. Long after the ceremonies ended, a lingering trauma that transformed memory into a haunting companion. Archaeological evidence also hints at the scale and precision of these rituals. Temples aligned with cosmic events, altars carefully carved and positioned, and skeletal remains showing signs of ceremonial preparation and violent rites. Through these records, we begin to understand not only the acts themselves, but also the minds of those who orchestrated them. Priests who had mastered the fusion of fear, awe, and devotion to consolidate power. The women were more than victims. They were central figures in a complex social and spiritual machinery, where suffering was sanctified and obedience equated with divine favor. As we contemplate these testimonies, the horror of their reality becomes unavoidable. The echoes of pain that once filled the stone corridors of temples resonating through centuries. Every detail, from ritual gestures to whispered chants, offers a chilling insight into a world where human suffering was ritualized, codified, and enshrined as sacred duty. And while we attempt to reconcile these events with our modern understanding, we are compelled to reflect. What would it truly feel like to live under such absolute control? To have one's life mapped out by divine decree and priestly authority? Share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you interpret the balance of devotion and terror in these ancient practices? The impact of these rituals extended far beyond the temple walls, reverberating through the social and religious fabric of Maya civilization. The ceremonies were not isolated spectacles. They were instruments of societal control, reinforcing hierarchies and the omnipotence of the priestly class. Families internalized the fear and reverence instilled by these acts, understanding that divine favor and social standing were intimately connected to the willingness to submit to the God's chosen path. The women themselves became symbols, their suffering a tangible manifestation of divine authority, their obedience a warning and an example for the broader population. Communities witnessed the rituals, absorbed their implications, and internalized the implicit threat. Deviation from the sacred order was inconceivable, and transgression carried consequences both spiritual and corporeal. The psychological imprint of these practices endured, shaping gender roles and societal expectations, intertwining faith with fear to ensure the stability of a system built on absolute religious hierarchy. Through these mechanisms, the priests exercised influence that reached into the hearts and minds of the living, dictating not only behavior, but belief, creating a culture where devotion and terror were inseparable, and where the memory of those chosen and sacrificed resonated as both cautionary tale and sacred testament. The duality of awe and dread, of sanctity and horror, became a foundation upon which the civilization's collective consciousness rested, leaving traces of both reverence and profound unease that echo through history even today. Beneath the overt displays of devotion and ritual, there existed a hidden dimension to the priest's control, a psychological and political manipulation that was subtle yet profound. The chosen women were instruments not only of spiritual appeasement, but of social governance, their suffering leveraged to reinforce the authority of those who orchestrated it. The rituals instilled obedience not just in the participants, but in the wider community, shaping perceptions of power, sanctity, and fear. Stories of the ceremonies circulated through villages, carried in whispers, and etched into collective memory, a warning that divine selection was absolute and immutable. Within this framework, the women's humanity was secondary to their symbolic role. They became living conduits of divine will, embodying the complex interplay of reverence, terror, and authority that sustained the priesthood. The subtle coercion embedded in these practices extended far beyond the walls of the temples, influencing marriage, alliances, and social interactions, as every member of society was reminded of the omnipotence of the gods and the unwavering reach of the clergy. The psychological ramifications of these rituals were staggering. A culture cultivated to internalize submission, to equate suffering with devotion, and to perpetuate the cycles of control and fear necessary for the continuation of the social and religious order. It was a sophisticated orchestration, blending the spiritual with the political, ensuring that every layer of society, men, women, and children alike, remained under the invisible yet unyielding gaze of those who held the sacred and the terrifying in their hands. The chosen women, in their suffering, became both witnesses and agents of a system that was far more intricate and insidious than the casual observer could ever comprehend. A chilling reminder of how power and devotion can be fused into instruments of absolute control. As the echoes of the rituals faded and the temple doors closed behind the chosen, the legacy of these acts lingered, etched into the collective memory of Maya civilization. The women, whether alive or claimed by sacrifice, had become permanent symbols of divine authority, their experiences shaping generations to come. The priest's orchestration of horror and holiness had created an enduring tension between reverence and fear, a duality that ensured their power remained unchallenged. Yet, in the silent aftermath, questions arise that transcend time. What did these women truly feel as they walked the path dictated by the gods? How did the community reconcile pride in divine selection with the visceral horror of the acts themselves? The temples, now quiet, stood as monuments to both devotion and cruelty, their stones heavy with history and unspoken stories. To understand these practices is to confront the unsettling truth that the divine and the horrific were often inseparable in ancient rites, and that the price of selection was both exaltation and unimaginable suffering. As we reflect on these chilling realities, we are reminded of the resilience and fragility of human life, and of the ways in which faith and power can be wielded to terrifying effect. If this exploration of the hidden horrors of Mayan rituals captivated you, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment with your thoughts and continue uncovering the darkest corners of ancient history by watching our next video.